from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
Two major superpowers emerged from World War II. In the West, the United States had proved its power in World War II. Their military led the way fighting against the Axis. The men and women on the home front supplied the soldiers with all the goods necessary to win a war, and the people of the United States used their minds to develop new technology that would help lead them into the future. The other superpower emerged from the East, and that was the Soviet Union. They proved vital in the war, fighting off Adolf Hitler and closing down the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union was practicing a new type of government, communism, and they began to thrive in an attempt to prove their way of life. These two superpowers will butt heads for more than 40 years. So where did all this mistrust begin? Do you remember this? FDR, Churchill, and Stalin met at Yalta in the Soviet Union to discuss a plan for the war's end and peace. There are three main achievements of the meeting. Number one, after the war, Germany would be divided into 4 military zones, occupied by the Allies. Number two, Stalin would allow free, democratic elections in Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe. And number three, the Soviets would declare war on Japan and aid the United States' fight in the Pacific. The Soviet Union did do its job in helping to divide Germany, and they also helped the United States by declaring war on Japan. But they fell short in one area. The Soviet Union did not hold to its promise to allow free elections in Europe. Instead, they helped to install communist governments in East Europe.
The Cold War was a conflict that lasted between 1945 and 1991, in which the United States and the Soviet Union sought ideological world dominance without directly confronting each other. At no time during the Cold War did American and Soviet troops directly fight each other. Yet both countries struggled to exert their ideology across the world. An ideology is a belief system, and the ideologies of the United States and the Soviet Union differed greatly. For example, they sought to protect the democracies of Europe from aggression. They sought to rebuild European economies for American capitalistic gains through trade. And they distrusted Stalin because of the non-aggression treaty he had signed with Hitler before World War II. By contrast, the Soviet Union sought to install communist regimes in the newly liberated countries of Eastern Europe. This would create a bloc of communist allies in Eastern Europe and would serve as a source of protection in case the West decided to invade. He also sought to capture resources of Eastern Europe as to rebuild the Soviet economy. And Stalin hated the West because of the secret atomic bomb that they had withheld from him, and for the delay in attacking Hitler in the Western Front during World War II.
A prime example of where we see the divide between communism and democracy is with the division of Germany. After World War II, Germany was split up and occupied as prescribed at Yalta. West Germany would be divided into 3 zones, held by the United States, England, and France. East Germany, which is the larger zone, would be held by the Soviet Union. The city of Berlin was also split into 4 military zones, held by the United States, England, France, and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union again got the largest piece. The Soviets also occupied the Eastern European nations taken from Hitler. The continent was now divided between a democratic Western Europe and a communist Eastern Europe.
The line that divided democratic Western Europe and communist Eastern Europe was known as the Iron Curtain. By early 1946, Stalin had installed communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. The Soviet-occupied countries of Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia all had communist governments who were allied to Moscow and answered to Stalin. At Yalta, Stalin had assured Churchill and Roosevelt that he would allow free democratic elections throughout Eastern Europe after the war. However, when these elections were held, Stalin decreed that all democratic parties and candidates were outlawed from running in the election. This assured that the communist candidates and parties that were running would win the election and rise to power. By definition, this was a violation of the Yalta Agreement because the elections were not free. With these Eastern European countries under communist rule, they became known as Soviet satellite nations, forming a communist bloc against the West. Stalin intended to use these nations as economic colonies for the betterment of the Soviet Union, and also as military and political allies in case the West decided to attack.
As hostility from the Soviet Union grows, Truman decides to stop babying the Soviets. The United States adopts a policy of containment. This policy states that the United States would resist Soviet attempts to expand its power and spread communism to other free countries. The United States pledged military force and economic aid to countries who resisted Soviet advances. In March of 1947, Harry Truman issues the Truman Doctrine. Truman promised economic and military aid to countries threatened by communism. Over the next 3 years, the United States sent over $400 million to Greece and Turkey keeping them democratic. The Truman Doctrine will dictate American foreign policy for the next 60 years, and even today.
The Truman Doctrine was a successful strategy, but more was needed to be done. The United States wanted to keep communism from spreading west throughout Europe. However, the US also wanted to avoid World War III with the Soviet Union, and was looking for alternatives. This leads to the Marshall Plan. In 1947, devastated by World War II, poverty and hunger plagued Western Europe. With agriculture and industry in ruins because of the war, poorer nations throughout Europe were more susceptible to communism because of the promise of equality that it gave them. When times get desperate, people tend to cling to radical ideas like communism. To prevent these poorer nations to turning to communism, Secretary of State George Marshall proposes the Marshall Plan in 1947. His plan would provide economic aid and supplies to all European nations who needed it. However, to qualify for this aid, nations had to openly pledge to resist communism. The plan was successful in helping to rebuild Western Europe after the war. Western European economies got back on their feet quicker, and it boosted US prestige in Europe because the United States was seen as a helping neighbor. It also diminished the appeal of communism to many Europeans, and because of this, for generations to come, many European voters would vote in favor of democracy and against communism.
An area in which the Cold War almost got hot was in Berlin, and what was known as the Berlin Airlift. In June of 1948, Stalin closed all ground access into the democratic West Berlin. As Berlin lies entirely in the Soviet zone, they were able to shut down all roadways and railways. Stalin was furious at the idea of a Western government and economy sitting in the communist East Germany. Stalin hoped to starve West Berlin into submission. Using the codename Operation Vittles, the United States and England broke the Soviet blockade with the Berlin Airlift. This was a 327-day campaign where 277,000 flights dropped 2.3 million tons of supplies into West Berlin by air. The United States wanted to do whatever they could to supply the West and prove that democracy would last. With the Soviet Union intentionally harming the citizens of West Berlin, it was a public relations nightmare, and eventually, the Soviets lifted the blockade, proving a victory for the West.
After the Berlin Airlift, the United States and our allies were concerned about a potential war with the Soviet Union, as Stalin became more bold and more daring. In 1949, to protect against future Soviet aggression, the West forms the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. NATO is a defensive alliance that was formed by 12 original member nations. NATO exists still today and is much bigger. This defensive alliance would pledge military support and collective defense in case of a Soviet attack. If the Soviet Union or her satellite nations were to attack any Western member of NATO, all member nations of NATO would pledge military support against the attack. The West hoped that the prospect of fighting so many member nations at once would deter Stalin from any future aggression and would help to prevent a future world war between the two superpowers.
So why does this matter? The United States still uses the ideas of the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan in order to aid countries avoiding oppressive governments. The idea is, the more democratic, successful, and capitalist nations there are around the world, the better the world economy will be. With open markets and free trade around the world, the United States economy will flourish as well. The United States also begins to see itself as a world police force. The idea is, if governments are treating people poorly, the United States will step in and help them. The United States has put this to the test many times, and there are many examples that can be cited. One of the biggest examples of this is with the US intervention in Kuwait. In the early 1990s, the country of Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded the small oil-rich nation of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein's goal was to get the oil from Kuwait and bring the profits to Iraq. President George Herbert Walker Bush committed US forces to stop the Iraqi invasion in what is famously known as Operation Desert Storm. The United States quickly defeated the Iraqi army and put an end to Saddam Hussein's advances on Kuwait.